What would you do if the only thing your father ever gave you was a small iron key with no letter, no address, no word of where to put it? 21 years old, alone in the world, with nothing in her hand but that key and a yellowed note from a solicitor she had never met. That is where Jane Mercer's story begins. But the door that key would open, and the quiet, patient love waiting on the other side of it, would rewrite everything she thought she knew about the man who had vanished from her life. Stay close. Settle in. Let us know where you're watching from tonight, because this is a story that unfolds slowly, the way old houses do, one shuttered room at a time. The coach set Jane down at the crossroads a full mile short of the village, for the driver would not take his horses down the rutted lane in such weather. Rain came sideways off the moor. She stood a moment, with her small carpet bag at her feet, and watched the coach disappear into the gray, its lamps swaying like two dim moons. Then she picked up the bag, drew her shawl tighter, and began to walk. Her boots were mended at the toes. Her dress was the black one she had worn to bury her mother 6 weeks past, and it was black still, only more tired. In the pocket sewn inside her bodice lay the iron key on its bit of twine, and folded around it the solicitor's note, its ink faded to the color of weak tea. Mallow Dean, it said, and the name of a man, Mr. Ashwell, and nothing else. She had used the last of her mother's savings for the fare. There had been debts to settle first, small ones, a milk bill, a coal bill, the doctor's fee for the last visit that had done no good. The landlord had taken the furniture in lieu of the final month. What was left had bought a coach seat and a loaf of bread, and now the bread was gone and the seat had set her down in the wet. Jane walked. The lane bent between high hedgerows dripping with autumn. Somewhere a rook called once and fell silent. She thought of her father as she walked, though she tried not to. She had seen him 4 times in her life that she could remember. Once when she was 5, a tall figure in a dark coat, who lifted her onto his knee and gave her a sugared almond. Once at 8, at a Rainian yard where he had spoken to her mother in a low voice for perhaps 10 minutes, and then gone again. Twice more before she was 12. After that, nothing. Not a letter, not a coin. When her mother spoke of him, which was seldom, she used the word gone as if he had died, though they both knew he had not. And then, a week after the funeral, the solicitor's note had arrived, forwarded from an address her mother had kept without ever explaining why. By the time Jane rounded the last bend and saw the smoke of Mallow Dean smudging the sky, the rain had settled into a fine gray mist and her hem was heavy with mud. The village was small. A church, a green, a public house with a swinging sign, a scatter of stone cottages, a smithy already shuttered for the evening. She asked at the public house for Mr. Ashwell, and was pointed without much interest toward a narrow door beside the coaching yard. Mr. Ashwell was a spare, elderly man with spectacles pushed high on his forehead and ink on the side of his hand. He listened to her name and rose slowly from behind his desk, as if a thing he had waited a long time for had at last arrived. "Miss Mercer," he said, "you have come." "I have," Jane said. He took the key from her palm when she offered it, turned it once in the candlelight, and gave it back. Then he reached into a drawer and drew out a paper folded 3 times and sealed with a wafer of red wax gone brittle with age. "Your father purchased a house in this village," he said, "some 11 years ago. It has been kept shuttered since. It is yours, if you will have it." Jane sat down without meaning to. The chair was hard beneath her. "A house," she said. "A small one, furnished in a fashion. The rates have been paid from a modest account he settled with me for that purpose. It wants airing, it wants a fire, it wants a broom. But it stands, Miss Mercer, and it is yours." She could not speak for a moment. Outside the window, the mist had thickened toward dusk, and somewhere a dog was barking at nothing. The house, when Mr. Ashwell walked her to it in the last gray light, stood at the far end of a lane that trailed off into a copse of alders. It was low, whitewashed once and long ago, its slate roof mottled with lichen, its windows blinded by warped board shutters nailed shut. A rambling hedge had grown up over the gate. The gutter above the porch sagged with the weight of a summer's dead leaves. A shrub Jane could not name pressed against a downstairs window like something trying to see in. She heard, before she saw them, the two women who had come to their doorstep across the lane to watch. They did not trouble to lower their voices. "That is the Mercer place, then, bought by a man nobody ever laid eyes on. A ruin, damp to the rafters. He might as well have left the poor girl a hole in the ground." Mr. Ashwell affected not to hear. He set the key in Jane's hand and closed her fingers over it with a gentleness that surprised her. "There is more to know," he said, "but not tonight. Tonight you are tired. Tomorrow, if you will call on me, we shall speak further." He tipped his hat and walked back up the lane. Jane stood alone at the gate in the failing light, with the whispers of the two women still audible behind her, and looked at the small, shuttered, forgotten thing that was now her only shelter in the world. Was this truly all a father's silence could leave behind? A damp house at the end of a lane, mocked by strangers before she had even stepped inside? Or was there something the village had already begun to guess at and had chosen not to say? If a story like this holds you, take a moment to leave a comment and to subscribe, so the next one finds you when it is ready. Because when Jane put her hand to that warped front door and turned the iron key, what waited in the dark on the other side was not a ruin at all. For a long moment she did not turn the key. She stood with her hand against the door and let the whispers behind her settle into the mist like everything else that evening had brought. The two women did not go inside. They lingered on their step, arms folded under shawls, and a third had joined them now, a broader woman with a lamp already lit against the gloom. Their voices carried down the lane in that particular country way, meant to be overheard and denied at once. Skin and bone, and in mourning by the look. Walked from the crossroads, they say, in this. No trunk, only that bag. Poor creature, what can she do with a place like that? Sell it for the slate, if the slate's any good. Jane did not turn her head. She had learned, in the 6 weeks since her mother's burial, that a still face was the cheapest armor a woman could wear. She set the carpetbag against the porch, kept the key in her palm, and waited for the lane to empty. It did not empty. A man in a heavy coat came up from the direction of the public house with a lantern swinging at his knee, and behind him a boy leading a pony. The man stopped level with the gate and raised the lantern deliberately, so that the light fell on Jane and on the sagging porch behind her. He was broad, ruddy, with a wet mustache and the kind of prosperous belly that fills a waistcoat like a proud thing. His eyes went over her once, from mended boots to muddy hem to the small pale face at the top, and he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh in the way a knife is cruel. It was worse. It was the laugh of a man who had already decided she was not worth cruelty. "So the Mercer daughter has come at last," he said. 12 years I have watched that roof grow moss and wondered what fool would trouble to claim it. Well, here she is." He tipped his hat with a mocking flourish. "Mr. Bramble, at your service. I have the fields either side of your inheritance, miss, and I have offered Ashwell a fair price for this plot 4 times over. Fair. When you have had a night under that roof, you will remember my name." "Good evening," Jane said. 2 words. 2. He laughed again and turned to the boy. "Did you hear? 2 words from the heiress of Mallow Dean." The boy did not laugh. The pony shifted its weight and blew steam into the mist. "Mr." Bramble looked back at Jane with something more measuring in his face. "The house is damp, girl. The chimney draws poor. The well by the alders has not been sounded in 10 years. Take a night. Take 2. Then come and see me at the Grange, and we shall speak sensibly." "Good evening," Jane said again. He made a small sound in his throat, half amusement, half dismissal, and walked on. The lantern light went with him. The women across the lane at last withdrew, one after another, and their doors clicked shut. The mist closed over the gate. Jane was almost alone when the last figure came. She came from the churchyard side, an old woman in a black cloak so long it swept the wet grass at the verge. Her hair beneath the hood was the color of ash, and her hands, folded over a walking stick, were knotted with age. She stopped at the gate. She did not step through. She looked at Jane, and then at the house, and then at Jane again, and her eyes were the sort of pale that country weather makes. "He built it against the day," the old woman said. "Mind you find the day, child." Jane opened her mouth to ask what day, and what he and how she knew. But the old woman had already turned. The cloak moved once through the mist and was gone, and Jane was left with the words folded quietly into her chest, along with the note and the key. She stood a moment longer. Then she put her hand to the door and turned the small iron key in the lock. It resisted. It resisted the way a thing resists that has not been asked anything in a long time, not with rust, but with reluctance. She pressed her shoulder to the wood. The lock gave. The door opened inward with a low, patient sigh, as if the house had been holding a breath for 11 years and had chosen this moment to let it out. The dark on the other side smelt of old wool and cold stone and, faintly, of beeswax. Not damp, not rot, beeswax. Jane stood on the threshold with the mist at her back and the smell of a cared-for room in her face, and did not for a moment understand. She fetched the carpet bag onto the step. She let her eyes adjust. Slowly, the interior separated itself into shapes. A narrow hall with a bench along one wall, pegs above the bench, a rag rug at her feet still holding the print of a boot that was not hers. A door to the left, closed. A door to the right, half open, a stair rising into deeper black at the back of the passage. Jane closed the front door behind her. The wind at once went quiet. She had no candle. She had matches in the bag, and a stub of tallow her landlady had given her the morning she left, and she felt her way to the little bench and sat down on it because her legs, without warning, had begun to shake. She had not eaten since the last of the loaf that noon. She had walked a mile in wet skirts. She had been laughed at by a stranger and blessed by another, and neither had told her what she was inside. She lit the stub. The small flame steadied. She lifted it. On the bench beside her lay a folded gray blanket of good wool, brushed clean. On the pegs above hung two things, a woman's shawl, plain, dark, and a child's oilskin cape sized for a girl perhaps 10 years old. Both had been there long enough for the folds to have set. Neither smelt of mold. Someone, at some year Jane could not name, had laid these out and shuttered the door and gone away. She sat with the candle in her hand and looked at the little cape for a long time. Then she rose. She did not open the doors yet. She was too tired for doors. She climbed the stair instead, one careful tread at a time, and found at the top a small bedchamber with a bedstead made up under a dust sheet, and drew the sheet back, and found the sheets beneath aired with lavender long ago gone brittle, and lay down in her muddy dress on top of the coverlet without undressing, because she did not trust herself to undress in a house she did not yet understand. The candle she blew out. She listened. The house creaked, as houses do, but under the creak there was another sound, softer, a slow, measured tick from a room she had not yet entered, a clock, somewhere below her, still keeping time. Jane closed her eyes. "Mind you find the day, child." She slept. She woke to gray light at the shutter slats and to the same slow ticking below, patient as a heart. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then the small iron key against her ribs and the smell of long-closed wool told her. She sat up. Her dress had stiffened in its mud. Her hair had come loose. The lavender in the sheets had left a faint, sweet dust on her cheek. Jane rose and drew the bolt on one shutter of the little bedchamber. The wood was warped, but the bolt slid. She pushed the shutter outward, and gray morning light came in over her hands. She saw the alders at the end of the garden, and the sagged gate, and beyond the hedge a strip of plowed field belonging, she supposed, to Mr. Bramble. The mist had lifted a little. A robin sat on a broken cane in what had once been a bed of something, and watched her without alarm. She turned back to the room. In the fuller light, the bedchamber showed itself carefully. A press against one wall. A small washstand with a china jug set upside down over the basin to keep the dust out. A chair. A print above the bed of a country lane. On the seat of the chair, folded, a nightgown of plain white linen, sized for a woman not much larger than Jane herself. She lifted it. The linen was aired and clean. It had been laid there and left. Jane set the nightgown down slowly. She stood very still. It came to her then that whoever had made this room ready had known, roughly, the size of the woman who might one day sleep in it. Not a child. A woman. Grown. She went downstairs. In daylight the hall showed its old paint, cream once, ivory now, and the pegs and the bench, and the rag rug with its boot print. She opened the left door first. It was a small parlor, a grate laid ready with coal and kindling, a wing chair drawn near the hearth, a round table by the window with 2 chairs at it and a folded cloth. On the mantel, between 2 plain candlesticks, an 8-day clock of dark wood, ticking, ticking, its brass hands showing the hour of not quite 7. The pendulum swung with a small hush. Jane crossed to it. The key hung on a hook beside it on a bit of red thread. It had been wound. It had been wound recently. She thought of Ashwell's ink-stained hand and the shuttered years and knew someone came in. Someone had come in perhaps a week ago, perhaps a month, and had wound this clock and had gone out again and locked the door. She stood before it and let the ticking go through her. The right-hand door gave onto a kitchen, small, stone-flagged, with a range grown cold, a scrubbed deal table, a dresser with a few white plates on end, a jug, a bread crock. On the table lay a single sheet of paper weighted by a stone. She picked it up. It was a list, in a copperplate hand, not her father's, but a woman's. Coal, flour, tea, candles, a pound of sugar, soap, with a little sum totted at the bottom, and below that, the words called Michaelmas last, all well. The ink was not fresh, it was not old either. Jane sat down at the table and put the list on the deal between her hands. Someone had come at Michaelmas. Someone kept the clock wound. Someone had laid a nightgown of her size on the chair upstairs. Her father, wherever he was, whatever he had become, had not left the house to stand empty. He had left it to be tended. She did not weep. She was too hungry to weep. She rose, found in the bread crock a stone jar with a lid, and inside the jar a small paper of tea and a twist of sugar dry as sand. In the crock beside it, a tin of ship's biscuit, sealed. She took 1 biscuit. She sat and ate it slowly with the list before her. Under the ticking of the clock in the next room, a small brown mouse crossed the flagstones by the range, saw her, and did not run. Jane watched it go into a crack by the coal scuttle. She felt, for the first time since her mother died, not entirely alone. She went out into the garden by the kitchen door, which unbolted from within without needing the iron key at all. The air was raw and smelled of wet earth. She followed a brick path half swallowed by grass to the alders, and there was the well, capped with a wooden lid weighted by a flat stone. She did not lift it. Mr. Bramble had said 10 years unsounded. She would sound it in her own time. She walked round the outside of the house. The whitewash had gray-greened on the north wall. Ivy had begun on the chimney. A downstairs window at the back had been shuttered inside as well as boarded outside. She noted it. She did not yet know why she noted it. At the rear corner, where the wall of the house met the low garden wall, she stopped. A stone in the house wall, at about the height of her shoulder, was not the same as its fellows. It was smaller, dressed smoother, set slightly proud. On its face, weathered but clear when she brushed the moss with her thumb, was cut a small mark, the letter M, and beneath it a date, 1858, and beneath that a second letter, J, M, and J, 11 years ago. The year Ashwell had named, the year the house was bought. Jane stood in the wet grass with her thumb on the stone. Her own initials, her mother's initials, either. Both. She did not know yet. She only knew that whoever had cut this stone had known there would be a J who came, and had wanted the J, when she came, to find her name in the wall. She left the mark and went back inside because the wind had risen, and she was cold to the bone. She did not tell herself yet what the stone meant. She set it aside, as one sets aside a letter one is not ready to answer, and she began, instead, to work. She began with the parlor hearth. She found a scuttle already half full of coal in the kitchen and a bundle of kindling under the range. She laid the fire as her mother had taught her, small sticks in a lattice, a knot of paper from the list she had already read and kept in her head, a lump of coal balanced on top. She struck a match. The flame took. Smoke went the wrong way once, curled back into the room, and then, as if remembering its manners, drew up the flue and away. Mr. Bramble had said the chimney drew poor. The chimney drew. She warmed her hands. Then she stood, took off the black dress she had worn to bury her mother 6 weeks before and had not been out of since, hung it on a chair to steam by the fire, and put on the white linen nightgown from the upstairs chair over her shift, and over that the woman's shawl from the peg in the hall. She thought, briefly, that she should feel strange in another woman's clothes. She did not. The shawl fitted her shoulders as if it had been folded for them. She scrubbed. She began at the front door and worked inward. The boot print on the rug she beat outside against the gatepost until the wool went pale again. The bench she wiped with a rag torn from her own hem. The flagstones of the kitchen she washed on her knees with water heated in a copper on the range. Her hands were red inside the first hour. Her back ached inside the second. She did not stop. As she worked, the house gave her things. Behind the parlor door, a walking stick with a horn handle, plain, the wood dark with use, sized for a man not tall. In a drawer of the kitchen dresser, 3 ivory-handled knives with the initials A.M. faint on the bolsters, worn from a hand that had held them a long time. In the press upstairs, when she looked at last, a folded man's coat of good black cloth, brushed and lavendered, and put away. She held the coat's shoulder for a moment and did not put it on. She closed the press. The mouse came out again at midday and sat on its haunches by the coal scuttle while she ate a second biscuit at the deal table. She spoke to it once. "You have kept the place," she said. "Better than I would have." The mouse washed its face and went home. It became, without either of them saying so, her companion. And later that afternoon, when she came in from beating a second rug against the gate, she found it waiting on the flagstone by the range as if it had wondered where she'd gone. By the time the light began to go, Jane had cleared the hall, scrubbed the kitchen, laid a fire in the range, and swept the parlor to its corners. She had found, without yet knowing she was looking for them, 6 more small oddnesses. A shelf in the parlor cupboard cut deeper than the shelves above and below it, so that the boards did not match. A keyhole in the paneling by the stair with no handle beside it, painted over. A patch of newer plaster on the wall of the shuttered back room, a rough rectangle the size of a small window, where no window should be. In the kitchen drawer with the knives, a folded slip of paper with a column of figures in her father's hand. She knew the hand, though she had seen it only on the back of one Christmas card kept in her mother's Bible, showing sums set aside quarterly, year on year, for 11 years. And on the beam above the parlor door, when she stood on a chair to wipe the cobweb from its underside, a name cut into the oak in small, careful letters. For Jane. She got down from the chair slowly. She stood with the rag in her hand and looked up at the beam. The fire in the grate behind her hushed and settled. Outside, somewhere on the lane, a cart went by and did not stop. The clock on the mantel struck the hour, 5 soft notes, and went back to its patient work. Jane did not weep then either. She folded the rag. She put it on the table. She sat down in the wing chair by the fire in her borrowed shawl, and she looked into the coals, and she began, at last, to understand that the house was not a ruin left to her by accident. The house was a letter, and she had been reading it all day with her hands. Jane slept that night in the small bedchamber and woke before the light, and it was the shuttered back room she went to first. She carried the tallow stub, though she did not need it yet, and the walking stick with the horn handle, because a stick was a comfort in a house whose rooms she had not entered. The door of the back room was stiff. It gave with the same low sigh the front door had made, as if the house made only one sound when it opened, and made it patiently. Inside was a small room, low-ceilinged, its one window boarded from without and shuttered from within, so that the dawn came into it only as a gray rumor along the edges of the boards. There was a writing desk against the far wall, a chair drawn up to it, a rug rolled and stood in a corner, and, on the wall to her right, the rectangle of newer plaster she had marked the day before. Jane set the tallow stub in a dish on the desk and lit it. The flame leaned, steadied, and made a small warm island in the gray. She tried the desk first. Its drop front was locked. She took the iron key from the twine at her neck without much hope, and it did not fit. She sat back on her heels. Then she remembered the painted-over keyhole in the paneling by the stair, and the shelf in the parlor cupboard cut too deep, and the rectangle of new plaster at her elbow, and she understood that this house had been built to be read slowly, in the order the reader was ready for. She went to the parlor cupboard and lifted the deep shelf. Beneath it, laid flat against the boards, was a second small iron key, longer than her own, wrapped in a scrap of blue paper. She carried it back to the desk. It turned. The drop front came down onto its brass supports, and the candle showed piece by piece what had been kept there. A ledger bound in green cloth, a bundle of letters tied with tape, a pocketbook, a folded map of the parish, a small tin box, and laid on top of it all a single sheet of paper, folded once, with her name on the outside in the hand she had known from one Christmas card in her mother's Bible. Jane sat down in the chair. She did not open the letter first. She opened the ledger because the letter frightened her, and figures did not. The ledger began in 1858 and went on year by year, quarter by quarter, in her father's small, careful writing. Rates paid. Roof mended in the 3rd year. Chimney swept in the 5th. A woman named on the margin, Mrs. Hoole, Michaelmas, aired the rooms, paid 2 shillings a quarter, 11 years running. A sum set aside for Jane's schooling that had never been drawn. A sum set aside for Jane's mother, sent quietly by a bank in another county, that Jane now understood had been the small, unexplained moneys her mother had once or twice mentioned and never named. She turned the pages, and the candle burned down a finger's width, and she began to weep, without noise, the way a person weeps who has been holding a thing for a long time and has set it down. She opened the bundle of letters next. They were her mother's, sent to her father at an address in a city Jane had never visited, and returned to him, it seemed, at his own request, when whatever business had held him there was done. There were not many, 12 perhaps, over as many years. In one, her mother wrote of Jane's first tooth. In another, of a fever that had almost taken her. In the last, dated the spring before Jane turned 12, her mother wrote that she would send no more, that Jane must be allowed to grow without the shape of a man who could not come home, and that if he wished to do a father's part, he must do it as he had begun, quietly, out of sight, against a day. Against a day. Jane heard the old woman at the gate again, in her long black cloak with the walking stick, and understood at last what she had been given at the door. She opened the letter with her name on it last. It was short. Her father wrote that he had done wrong by her mother and by her, in ways he would not set down here because they were not fit to be softened by paper, and that he had been a man whose name could not be given to a child without hurt. He wrote that he had made what he could: a roof, a hearth, a bed aired every Michaelmas, a shawl on a peg, an oilskin for a girl of 10 in case she came at 10, a coat for himself in case he ever earned the right to walk in it, a small sum quarterly against every year she lived. He wrote that he did not ask her forgiveness because it was not his to ask. He wrote that the house was hers freely, in her mother's name and her own, unencumbered, that Ashwell had the papers, that Bramble at the Grange had tried 3 times to buy it and had been 3 times refused, and that the well was sound, whatever the village said, because he had had it sounded himself the summer before he stopped coming. He wrote, at the end, I built it against the day, Jane. I hope the day is not too dark when it finds you. He signed his name, Andrew Mercer, which she had not known in full until then. A.M. on the bolsters of the knives. Jane sat with the letter open on her knee until the candle guttered and the gray at the edges of the shutters had become white. Then she folded it, put it back on the desk, and laid her hand flat on the wood and said, aloud, to no one, thank you. The house creaked around her as houses do at first light, and the clock in the parlor struck 7, and she got up and she opened the shutters. The weather changed in the afternoon. It had been fine when Jane walked to the village at midday to spend the last of her coins on a loaf, a twist of tea, and a candle from the little shop by the smithy, and to leave word at Ashwell's door that she would call the next morning. By the time she came back along the lane with the loaf under her arm, the sky over the moor had gone the color of wet slate, and the alders at the end of her garden were turning their leaves white in a wind that had not been there an hour before. By 4, the rain had begun in earnest, and by 5, it was coming sideways off the moor in gray sheets that struck the shutters like handfuls of gravel. Jane laid a second fire in the kitchen range and moved the wing chair nearer the parlor hearth and sat with the letter folded in her lap, listening to the house take the storm. A slate slid somewhere above her and cracked on the path. A gutter overflowed and sent a rope of water past the parlor window. The chimney drew and drew. She was thinking of going up to bed when she heard the knocking. It was not the wind. It was a fist, low on the front door, and a voice under it that she could not at first make out. Jane opened the door on the chain her father had put there 11 years ago, and had oiled, she now understood, at some Michaelmas since. On the step stood a woman she did not know, hooded in a soaked shawl, with a child of perhaps 4 on her hip, and another, a boy of 7 or 8, clinging white-faced to her skirts. Behind them, out at the gate, a cart lay tipped on its side in the lane, one wheel spinning slow in the wet, and a pony standing with its head down in the ditch. "Please," the woman said, "the wheel." Jane unhooked the chain. She brought them into the kitchen because the kitchen was warmest, and she brought the pony under the lee of the porch and put a folded sack over its back because there was no stable, and she sent the boy for Mr. Bramble's man at the Grange with a scrap of paper in her own hand, asking, plainly, for help with a cart in her lane. She did not ask for herself. She asked for the cart. The woman was called Mrs. Ives. She was on her way to her sister at the far end of the parish and had misjudged the storm. The little one was feverish, and had been feverish since morning. Jane put the child in the wing chair by the parlor fire and wrapped her in the good gray blanket from the hall bench and sent Mrs. Ives up to the bedchamber to change out of her wet things into the white linen nightgown and the woman's shawl from the peg. Mrs. Ives wept when Jane put the nightgown in her arms without knowing why, and Jane did not tell her. The boy came back at last with a lantern and a large ruddy man behind him who was Mr. Bramble himself, in oilskins, with 2 of his men and a length of rope. Mr. Bramble stood in Jane's porch and looked into her lit hall and did not for a moment speak. Then he touched his hat, which he had not done the night before, and said, "Miss Mercer." Jane said, "The cart is in the lane." Mr. Bramble said, "Aye." They got the cart up in an hour. Mr. Bramble came back to the porch after and stood in the rain with his hat in his hand. He looked past Jane at the fire in the parlor grate and at the clock on the mantel and at the child asleep in the wing chair under the blanket, and he said quietly, "Chimney draws." Jane said, "It does." Mr. Bramble said, "The well?" Jane said, "Sound?" He nodded once. He said, "I was wrong at the gate." Jane said, "Good night, Mr. Bramble." He put his hat on and went. That night Jane made up the small bedchamber for Mrs. Ives and the children, and slept herself in the wing chair by the parlor fire, with her father's letter folded in her hand. The storm went on until near dawn. The house did not leak. Somewhere in the small hours the child's fever broke, and Mrs. Ives came softly down and stood in the parlor door and looked at Jane asleep in the chair and did not wake her, and went back up. Jane woke at first light to a quiet house and a clean gray sky, and understood, without needing to name it yet, that she had chosen. By mid-morning the lane was busy in a way it had not been since Jane came. Mr. Bramble's men returned with a load of slate to replace what the storm had cracked, and would take no coin. Mrs. Ives went on to her sister at noon with the younger child pink-cheeked in her arms, and stopped at the gate to press Jane's reddened hand between her own. Ashwell came up the path in the afternoon with a satchel under his arm, sat at the deal table in the kitchen, and laid out the deeds. He said quietly that everything was as her father had written, that the house stood in her name, unencumbered, and had done so since the spring of 1858. He said Mrs. Hoole, who had aired the rooms every Michaelmas, would be glad to call when Jane wished. He looked at the ledger, at the letter, at the shawl on Jane's shoulders, and said only, he did what he could in the end. Jane said, "I know." The two women across the lane came over with a jar of honey and a loaf and did not meet Jane's eye at first. The broader woman with the lamp said her mother had known a mercer once, long ago, and had spoken well of him. Jane thanked her and took the loaf. Mr. Bramble came at dusk without his lantern, hat in hand at the gate, and asked if she would sell him the strip of orchard at the back, at a fair price, whenever she was ready, and if she was not ready, he would keep his fields tidy against her hedge and think no less of her. Jane said she would think on it. He said that was right. In the churchyard on Sunday, the old woman in the long black cloak passed her at the lych gate, laid a knotted hand on Jane's sleeve and said, "You found the day." Jane said, "I did." The village, which had laughed at a shuttered house and a girl in mended boots, began to nod to her in the lane, and to call her Miss Mercer, and to leave small things on her step, a bundle of kindling, 3 brown eggs, a jar of plum preserve with no name on the paper. By the end of that week, the shutters were down from every window, and the house showed its face to the lane in whitewash the color of new milk under the autumn sun. A month on, at the soft hour when the light over the moor turns the color of pressed brass, Jane stood at her gate with the gray wool shawl on her shoulders and the small iron key on its bit of twine still at her neck. The alders had gone gold. Smoke rose thin and straight from her chimney. The 8-day clock inside was ticking. Mrs. Hoole had called that morning and taken tea at the deal table and left promising to come again. Ashwell had sent word that the last of the quarterly sum was hers to draw when she wished, and Jane, who had learned to keep still, did not intend to draw it soon. She thought of the man in the dark coat who had lifted her onto his knee once when she was 5, and of the sugared almond, and of the shawl that had waited 11 years on a peg for shoulders it had never met until hers. She laid her hand on the gate-post. A robin came to the broken cane in the garden. "He did not leave me a house," Jane said softly, "to no one, and to the alders, and to the quiet lane. He left me a place to begin." She went inside and shut the door, and the small iron key hung warm against her ribs. Thank you for staying to the end of Jane's story, for walking the muddy lane with her and standing at the gate and finding at last the day. If this quiet homecoming moved you, leave a kind word below, tap the like, and subscribe for the next tale we have waiting. Another shuttered door, another key, another life the world dismissed too soon.